Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Simpatico Studios where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on simpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey adapters, welcome back. Today our guests are Jacqui Bauer and Matthew Naud. Jacqui was the first city sustainability coordinator in Bloomington, Indiana, where she spearheaded energy, waste reduction, active transportation programs, and access to clean water. She served as the assistant director of the Ostrom Workshop at Indiana University under Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom. Matthew was the first environmental coordinator for the city of Ann Arbor. He has 30 years of experience leading innovative urban sustainability programs. Matthew has direct experience working with universities to identify policy-relevant data for city planning efforts. He is currently a senior consultant with Adapt City and Resource Recycling Systems. Jacqui and Matthew introduce us to the split incentive and information deficit problems that make the rental sector so challenging in terms of efficiency and sustainability. They also share how underperformance in the rental sector particularly burdens low-income and student populations and how improving the sector can create a boon for local economies. Hey guys, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
All right, this is a topic that I don't know a lot about, so I'm very interested in hearing what you guys have to say, and obviously it's very important, but maybe Jacqui will just, jump in with you. I mean, what is RentLab, and maybe just kind of give some context of what we're going to talk about here.
Sure. This whole concept sprang out of work that Matt and I both did with the cities we were working for at the time. And when you say you're not familiar with it, that's pretty typical. People don't see that what a sort of challenge rental housing is, because there's a lot of assumptions about why it shouldn't be a problem. But what we're trying to tackle is the barriers to efficiency, to sustainability, and to affordability in rental housing that's tied to what you mentioned, the split incentive problem. So basically, it's very, very hard to get the incentives to align so that rentals are as efficient and affordable as they could be. And generally what ends up happening is that burden falls on the renter, which are disproportionately lower income households. So we're trying to bring some visibility, some transparency to that sector that isn't there already.
Okay, Matt, maybe you could tell us a little bit of history. How did you end up partnering with Jacqui?
So we were both part of something called the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And it's the nice thing about RentLab, because it's really built for cities and by cities. So most people don't know that, Ann Arbor, 54% of all the housing units are rental. In Bloomington, where Jacqui was, it's over 60. So we got 14 cities together that all kind of recognize this as a problem, got a little grant from USDN.org, and helped build this prototype for how do we get not only rental cost across to renters, but what are the energy costs and how can they better understand that true cost of housing. So probably 7 years ago that got started, and here we are today.
All right. Well, okay, Jacqui, you touched upon this a bit, but I still think maybe it'd be helpful to elaborate a bit more. It's like when you think of sustainability and rental housing, it's still not completely clear. Can you just explain that?
Sure. So buildings overall use a huge proportion of the energy we consume in this country. I think the estimate is around 40%. And of course, residential housing makes up a huge proportion of that. And rentals make up a very large portion of residential housing. So I'm sort of walking through all the stats here. But in cities, rentals tend to make up about 50 plus percent of the housing in cities. And so when cities are looking at their climate footprints, and many cities now have climate action plans, they've set goals for themselves. Many of them have adopted climate emergency resolutions that require them to bring their emissions down to a fraction of what it is now, or to zero by a certain year. And they can't get there without tackling rental housing. So, when we break down where all of a city's emissions come from, we've got buildings overall, housing, rental housing making up 50% of that. So I think that people don't really think of that as being significant, but owner-occupied home, I have an incentive to make investments in my property because I directly benefit by the savings I see in my utility bills. In a rental, there's a disconnect there. And so rentals tend to be chronically underinvested in. So there's very little incentive for a landlord to put insulation in the attic, or to insulate the walls, or put in a more efficient furnace, because they aren't the ones typically that are paying the bills. So we are trying to address that disconnect. But there's an affordability component to that, because those rental households end up paying a lot more money. They have a much higher utility burden than a typical home. And that has sustainability consequences, in that those homes then consume a lot more energy than they really need to. So I think it is common. It is not a lot of people see or think about that connection, and we're really trying to get people to recognize that and think about it in a more deliberate way that affects the decisions they make about where they live and about the properties that they own.
Well, Matt, can you elaborate on that too? And I guess I've never thought about it. They talk about buildings are a huge consumer of energy, but then it's an issue of responsibility. And Jacqui, you alluded to it. Just the landlords are sort of this X factor, and who ultimately is taking responsibility? The people that live there, which are the renters, but then the landlord actually owns the place. And is there? And Matt, could you answer this? Do you have to talk to landlords on an individual basis, or is there a way to collectively kind of like influence this demographic?
Right. Well, we think there's a number of models to solve this. In a perfect world, this would just be voluntary, and this information would be readily available. And unfortunately, landlords often aren't the ones paying the bills, so they don't often have access to the data from the utility company. So, we think, I think there's a number of ways to solve this, and Jacqui can talk more about some of the landlords we've spoken with that are very receptive. And we think RentLab can be an opportunity to really celebrate the landlords that are working hard in this space, that are making their places more efficient, more carbon neutral, more renewable energy. As we try and bring the rest of the housing units, up to speed. And, some cities are using more of a regulatory approach, and Boulder's doing that and kind of requiring a certain level of energy efficiency and transparency to these data.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to that, I mean, we're absolutely working with landlords and talking to all the various stakeholders that are involved. But part of what we're doing is building a platform where anyone can access this information. And so when I'm looking for a rental in my community, I can actually pull up this map and see how all the different rentals compare to each other, and get an idea of what's a normal energy bill or what's a normal utility bill for this community, and where my bills actually end up. So if I know that the average bill in my community is $50 a bedroom and I'm paying $150, then that empowers me to really try to understand why. And some of it's behavioral, some of it's due to the building, but we're really trying to give tenants what they need to know to then go to their landlords and perhaps ask for improvements, or be in a position before they sign a lease to understand or to ask for improvements. But we also want landlords to see, Matt mentioned that landlords don't typically have access to the utility bills. So we're trying to give them better information about their properties. So if I own 8 properties and 1 or 2 of them is massively underperforming the others, then I think there are a lot of landlords out there that will act on that information, especially if their tenants are asking questions.
All right, so maybe you both can take a crack at this, but is the transitory nature of a renter make your job easier or harder?
Harder. I mean, there are about 10 great reasons why this will never work.
Okay.
I mean, renters are transitory. In a lot of the cities where we work, they're college towns, so these are often their bills are perhaps being picked up by their parents. So there's a split incentive that's split again because I'm just passing the bill along to my mom, not paying any attention to it myself. College students are renting their first place ever, and so they don't have any clue about what's normal or what questions to ask, anything like that. Then there's the split incentive problem on top of that, and then there's it's really a fraction of their total cost of living. So I'm able to just sort of dismiss, maybe my utility bills are a little bit high, but I'm more worried about being able to make the rent, or maybe my tuition, or maybe my medical bills, or whatever my barriers might be. So trying to draw people's attention to the sustainability issues associated with rentals and these cost issues, it's hard. It's a really, really hard thing to bring into people's sort of sphere of attention. People have stuff going on, especially lower income families that may really be struggling with this. And the last thing they have time to think about is whether there's insulation in the attic.
And Matt, please elaborate.
Well, and I'd like Jacqui to kind of chime in, because she's been doing some, we've got real data from some cities. And so I think that's the other piece that we're able to do, is kind of really start telling the story in these cities, because nobody talks about how much they pay in energy. So Jacqui's got some data about per bedroom cost. Yeah.
So one of the examples that I often will cite, I mean, we have a lot of really great data in some all electric properties, so they don't have to pay gas. So we know we have their full, we know we have all their energy data. And in this one tranche of properties, the bills per bedroom range from $15 a bedroom to $180 a bedroom. And that's for the same period of time. So those types of massive differences are, we want people to know that kind of information. And if you think about, someone especially who's on a tight budget, that can be the difference between being able to afford staying in that property or having to move, or perhaps not being able to afford some other critical expense that you need to be able to deal with for your family.
All right, I've got a question from Mike in the community room, and I'd let either one want to take this. How are you getting the word out to landlords about RentLab?
So we're working with cities, and we're really still pretty early stage. So in the cities where we're working, so Flagstaff, Arizona is one example, we're actually reaching out to the landlords in that community to try to develop some partnerships. We're early on and enough there that the partnerships with landlords, with some of our sort of more proactive, community-minded landlords, are a good way to get us started. We really want people to have an initial positive interaction with the site, because there are inevitably properties and landlords that are going to not look as good on the site once the data starts getting more and more visible. But the point, and Matt mentioned this earlier, the point isn't really to shame the people that are not doing well. It's to celebrate and give sort of a nudge and an incentive to the people who are making these investments, maybe get them to make a little bit more of an investment, and then really start looking at how we can improve some of the other locations. So in Flagstaff, what we're doing is focusing on the landlords that are actually sharing information with us, rather than starting off the site with these sort of negative stories. But we do find that the landlords there are a lot of landlords that take a lot of pride in the way they manage their properties, and they look at this as sort of an asset, as a way of getting better information. So right now it's really one-on-one outreach. We work with the cities to kind of identify the landlords who we think will be those early adopters. And then we sort of build from there. And it's tricky to get everybody on board. But we're at the same time sort of trying to build a following in the tenant sector too. And, it's pretty easy to find tenants who have had a really huge utility bill that kind of knocked them back. So trying to connect with those people and get people to share their data is another way. So it ends up being sort of a community approach, getting all this information pulled together.
Okay, Matt, I got a question from you from Ken in the community room. Are companies that sell eco-efficient solutions like water heaters, heating, cooling, insulation, etc., good partners for RentLab?
Sure, because I think, again, as Jacqui said, we see cities as our clients, that they're the ones that really want to understand this market. And, I know for a fact that Ann Arbor has a very aggressive climate program, carbon neutrality, and they're talking with the manufacturers of these high efficiency heat pumps and how can we start building those markets and group buys and things like that. So absolutely, we think the folks that are in that business of helping these rental units become more energy efficient, but that's also more affordable. And the other thing you see is it's more comfortable for the tenants, which we think actually, if it were more efficient and more comfortable, tenants would stay longer and that would save the landlord money.
Yeah. Yep. And to add to that, just to get to those partnership angles, this really, another really important partner in this is utilities. And there's a few different angles, a few different reasons why, but, to some extent, getting better data out there can help utilities sort of understand where their efficiency programs and their rebate programs are having an impact or need to have an impact, maybe help identify the types of properties that are underperforming so that they can create programs around that. And, almost all utilities have some kind of efficiency standard that they're trying to hit. And so there's an opportunity for utility companies to sort of partner with us on this too. And we're working on that in a couple of communities where we're working.
Okay, so this maybe again is a question for both of you, and there's the whole concept of energy equity. And are there cities, and I guess there's two parts of this question, are cities empowered to enforce, I guess, what you guys are dealing with energy equity? And are there cities that are doing it relatively well?
That's sort of a tricky question, and enforcement is a little bit of a tricky word. I would say what cities at this point are focusing on is disclosure and benchmarking. So what they're doing, what a lot of cities are doing, are requiring certain types of building to actually share information. In a lot of ways, our model is built on that whole disclosure and benchmarking idea. Those city requirements typically don't get to the level of detail that we're getting to, where we're actually trying to build a data set with information on specific units or specific properties, specific apartment complexes. So they don't get to that level. Many of them don't address multifamily, or they don't address single family. So they miss a lot of the rental properties that are out there. So we're really following that same model of transparency. So that's an example of the type of sort of cities sort of quote unquote enforcing or developing policies around energy equity. The other thing that people are doing is creating targeted programs that help address some of the areas or the types of housing that may be least efficient and affect the sort of most vulnerable populations. They can, some cities can enact building code upgrades. So there's a number of different things cities can do. I don't know that most cities, I guess there are cities that also own their own utilities, and they would have some influence over how they charge rates and how they can sort of think about energy equity that way. But I don't know, Matt, what am I missing?
No, I think you're right. So equity is super important to all of the city sustainability directors. The question is, how do you solve for it in this messy rental housing space? And I think that's where this idea of, RentLab is a way to kind of create transparency. Do renters have a right to know what their likely energy bills are going to be? And how do we get that information across and organize it across cities so that, I think with a new administration and a new focus on climate, there are going to be big programs that are going to drive investment in this space. And that the cities with better data are going to be better able to be ready for those kind of shovel-ready projects, and also measure progress, because right now there's not a baseline in most cities to even measure how you're improving over time.
Do you see yourselves in the work that you're doing in the Green New Deal?
Oh, sure.
All right, well, help us. Like this, it's it's an aspirational document, but that they get specific, and I think, I think a lot of people see themselves in that, and some of them see specifically. But maybe you could tell us like where that would be relevant to what you're doing. You don't have to like quote a particular passage or anything, but
a lot of the Green New Deal is about, how do we solve for climate change in a just and equitable way? Yeah. And do it in a way that creates good jobs for people. So, I think the example is Ann Arbor spends $200 million a year on energy. And a lot of that leaves the state to go pay for coal in Montana. And if I'm investing in high efficiency heat pumps, those are local contractors that you're paying to do that work. In our case in Michigan, we have several big appliance manufacturers, Whirlpool, Bradford White. A lot of those appliances get built and bought from those companies. In a perfect world, we're recycling those old natural gas appliances, breaking them down into their pieces again, and feeding that into the manufacturing of new high efficiency heat pumps. So, and I think there's a lot of ways we can create those jobs in cities that are hard hit economically, and ideally with hard to employ individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even the work like energy efficiency, things that upgrade the energy efficiency of housing, like ceiling and insulation, all of that kind of stuff. Those kinds of jobs can't be exported. They're here, So it is a way to keep dollars local. If you're not putting money into your utility bill, you're keeping that money to spend on local in local businesses. Able to spend it on things that are going to benefit your family, perhaps education, all kinds of different things that might benefit a household in a different way. So there's so much that we do that deals with justice in housing and efficiency in housing, climate change. All of these things run so nicely in parallel with the Green New Deal. So yeah, I absolutely think that we have a lot of synergies with that.
Well, that's great. Okay, I've got another question. We're heading toward the end of our episode here, but another question from Ken is, would this platform, and meaning what you're doing, be of value to homeowners as well? It seems like the benchmarking info would also be of interest to them, and could that add more relevant data?
We get this question a lot, and the information we're talking about is absolutely something that could be of interest to homeowners. And part of the reason we haven't tried to tackle that is because the rental sector is so complicated. We are trying to stay focused on developing solutions for that problem. And there are the situation, the incentives arrangement with homeowner occupied housing is much different than rental housing, and it lends itself better to actually making improvements in those properties. You also have access to the bills. There's less transients in homeowner occupied housing. So that is just not an area we've chosen to focus. I think there may be a role for that later, but we really are focused on trying to develop some solutions in this sector because we see it as such a big challenge for climate action.
Okay, well, we're at the end of our episode, and I just want to kind of end this with like, what's next? Matt, let's take a crack with you, but then Jacqui, we could wrap up with you.
No, I think there's going to be some great opportunities. I think I'm convinced that the town-gown cities, so the cities with universities, this creates an amazing research database to start to figure out how does public education affect energy efficiency and energy use? How does new technology investment? So I think there's just some real opportunities in that town-gown space to get this started.
Excellent.
Yeah, and to build on that, we are still pretty early on. We've been working on this for a few years, but only a couple of years as an actual independent company. And so we're still in the process of building those data sets, of understanding what works and what doesn't, of actually building out the data site or the database and the website so that they're completely functional and workable. RentLab.org is the site. And I will say too, just because we tend to talk so much about the climate and the energy components of the site, but we actually are trying to address a very broad swath of sustainability issues, including access to recycling, access to active transportation, so being able to walk or bike or take transit from these rental properties. So we're really trying to look at a very, very broad spectrum of sustainability related features in rental properties and trying to get people to think about all of those things that tend to be pretty invisible when you're making rental housing decisions.
Okay, well, I learned a new topic. This was exciting for me, and you guys are doing very important work. And I hope maybe we can get you back, and maybe there's a project or a city that maybe that's helpful to you. And certainly want to encourage the kind of work that you're doing here. But I want you to stay on. We're going to go into just chatting for a few minutes. But thanks again for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us.
All right, we'll be right back. Just hold on.